Beginning of the 16th century, European colonial powers, including Netherlands, Portugal, France, and Great Britain, systematically subjugated the African continent. Their goal was the unpunished exploration of natural resources, the plunder of cultural treasures, and above all, the enslavement of formerly liberated African people. Divide and rule principle became the foundation of their domination. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 legalized this order, turning the continent into a giant prison with artificial closed borders created for the convenience of looting resources, mines, and plantation. This system found support in the so-called progressive and civilized Western world, which considered this state of affairs immutable. Despite everything, in response to this oppression, the invisible fury of African spirits, freedom ignited the fire of Pan-Africanism.
Pan-Africanism comes from a very long tradition. It comes from the tradition of the resistance and struggle of our people for self-determination, for independence. And very key figures contributed a lot to the construction of the concept of Pan-Africanism. Key figures like Martin Delany and then Edward Wilmot from Liberia, including key figures like Nkrumah, who contributed a lot in constructing what Pan-Africanism is today, but rooted in the struggle of the working people.
Today, it makes no sense to expect the promised freedom and equality from the United States. 100 years ago, it would be simply foolish to expect a humane treatment. Therefore, Afro-American freedom fighters with a flame of Pan-Africanism burning in their hearts became convinced that Africans could only achieve true freedom on their own continent by uniting in their fight against colonizers.
But essentially, Pan-Africanism is the collective mobilization of black people in Africa and in diaspora, okay, to fight racial inequality, to fight injustices and all of that. That's really the essence of Pan-Africanism.
At the end of the 19th century, the dream of African freedom struck the first spark of future touch and found its first clarion voice. That voice belonged to Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican politician and entrepreneur whose speeches touched the hearts of millions. His famous motto, Africa for Africans, became the cornerstone of nascent movements, transforming an abstract dream into a concrete political call.
I must say that one credit that you can give to Marcus Garvey was his pragmatic, approach to Pan-Africanism. Marcus Garvey didn't only think about Pan-Africanism, but he implemented pragmatic measures in attaining it. I mean, he constructed the Black Star Line whose responsibility was to bring back people of African descent to the African continent.
Marcus Garvey, also from the Caribbean, Jamaica, precisely, where he looked at Pan-Africanism as an avenue for economic empowerment for the African peoples, wherever they were. He had built the first Black Wall Street, he had the Black Star Line, he had, I think he is the first person, at least in the past century, to have had 1 million members who were Black to join an economic movement. Right?
Almost at the same time, Professor of History William Edward Bacchard Du Bois undertook a groundbreaking sociological study, the Philadelphia Negroes, in the United States. Based on hundreds of interviews and meticulous data collection, this extensive work became one of the first scholarly works in America, detailing the living conditions, social structure, the systemic problems of urban Afro-American community. Du Bois' study laid the intellectual foundation for understanding of the reality faced by the black people in the diaspora.
The earliest representation of Pan-Africanism came from Henry Sylvester Williams. I think he's actually the one who coined the term Pan-Africanism in the late 1800s.
The movement gained legal status thanks to Henry Sylvester Williams, who founded the African Association in London in 1897. He lit the first flame of freedom in 1900 when he organized the first African conference in history. This event gave the movement its name and its official launch. Du Bois joined this historic conference, becoming one of the leading intellectuals and masterminds of the burgeoning Pan-Africanism.
He was invited to attend the first Pan-African Congress in 1900 in London. Now, all the time, Du Bois had been writing and talking about the color line, how we, black people in Africa and all over the world, how we are treated, how we can integrate ourselves and how we can come together. Now, he's someone who believes in integration. Let's all live together. He's never someone who believes in separatism, that black people should live separated from white people and all that. He just believes that collectively we can find solutions to our problems and all that. So that's how he wound up in the first Pan-African Congress and the most important Pan-African Congress of all, which was in Manchester in 1945.
The 5th Pan-African Congress, held in Charlton-on-Medlock Town Hall, was a major turning point in the history of Pan-Africanism. It inaugurated a dramatic change in the struggle against colonialism. The spark of ideas and fiery speeches flared finally into a blazing fire that could no longer be extinguished or ignored.
Pan-Africanism as an ideology concretized in 1945 at the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester. It was at this Congress that a final resolution was passed, which saw national liberation as a direct component of the Pan-Africanist struggles. And then it also identified the unity of the African people after national liberation as a very important part of that struggle of Africans on the continent and the diaspora.
Unlike previous meetings, this Congress was marked by a radical mindset, bringing together the continent's future leaders, not theorists. Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and Hastings Banda were among the delegates. Du
Bois sort of served as a spiritual leader because he was older than all of them. He's a spiritual leader for the Congress, and he guided them to the various deliberations and all of that.
Manchester, 1945, the defeat of the fascists. But at the end of the war in 1945, when many Africans died and many fought to liberate Europe, people flew back into the countries and they were still colonized. That's a very staunch contradiction, right? It's the same contradiction today as we look at our lands. They say we are so rich, but we are poor at the same time. So that was the vivid contradiction of the 40s. Then there was a call to organize the Manchester meeting.
Participants claimed immediate independence, declaring openly that in case freedom is not granted voluntarily, it will be taken by force. Coming back to the Gold Coast, Kwame Nkrumah lit a fuse of liberation. He founded the Convention People's Party. He led a campaign of non-violent resistance, using strikes, boycotts, and civil disobedience. The arrest of Kwame Nkrumah and other CPP leaders only strengthened their popularity, turning Kwame Nkrumah into a martyr and a symbol of the struggle. Under pressure, Britain was forced to hold the first general election. Nkrumah's party swept into a landslide win, even though he remained in prison, forcing the colonial authorities to release him and appoint him the prime minister position. This was a decisive step towards independence, which was declared in 1957, making Ghana the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to throw off colonial bondage. However, Nkrumah considered the independence of Ghana alone was meaningless without total liberation of the entire African continent.
Kwame Nkrumah built this institution based on what they decided in 1945. We want to control the state to make sure we change the nature of the state so that the state benefit the people, have access, so the Ghanaians can have access to the education, to health care, to the Tema Road that everybody keeps using that Nkrumah built back in the 60s, right? That all of these things that we benefited from Kwame Nkrumah was not theoretical, and that he wanted African countries to do the same.
In an effort to spread the flame of liberation across the continent, Kwame Nkrumah convened the All-African People's Conference in Accra in 1958. The forum was attended by more than 300 delegates from 28 countries. The main goal was to coordinate and provide moral support to the national liberation movements.
Forward then to independence. To independence now. Tomorrow, the United States of Africa.
Nkrumah, who saw the African future in political unity, found his future comrades here. Among the participants were Kenneth Kaunda, future president of Zambia, Joaquim Chissano, future president of Mozambique, and ardent Patrice Lumumba, future prime minister of Congo.
There was a discussion that we are organizing this meeting with progressive forces of the African continent, but Congo is not represented. The reason Congo wasn't represented is because the penetration with information in the Congo was not easy. It's the same reality today, right? Back then, the Belgians made sure people did not know really what was happening in the Congo. So the Kenyan delegation went into Kinshasa asking people around, looking for some progressive, are they people who go into this conference? Are they people who could participate? And of course, in the city, people knew who Patrice Lumumba was. Oh yes, there was this young man with his friends, they are mobilizing and organizing. Right? He met Fanon, he met Kwame Nkrumah, who had theory and practice, right? He became the head of state of Ghana. So it was very clear that the movement in the Congo needed to move from a national movement to a Pan-African movement.
All-African People's Conference in 1958 became the oxygen that turned the flame of liberation into unstoppable fire. Year of Africa, 1960, the year when the flame of independence lit up 17 countries. On this wave, Kwame Nkrumah delivered a pivotal speech at the UN on behalf of the entire continent. He claimed the complete termination of colonialism and the condemnation of apartheid, insisting on political and economic union. His famous words, "We must unite or perish," and the proclaimed principle of Africa for Africans became a manifesto of African independence. This fiery speech paved the direct way to the creation of the Organization of African Unity 5 years later. Non-violent resistance, as in Ghana, was rather an exception. In many other countries, rivers of blood had to be spilled to get freedom. Algeria endured a bloody 8-year war against French colonists. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising was a response to British expropriation of Kibuyu lands. Angola and many other territories endured years of armed conflicts. Having achieved sovereignty and fearing its loss, the new states began protecting their borders vigilantly, and it is impossible to kindle the fire of freedom if everyone keeps the fuel for himself. Nkrumah's dream of a united Africa stalled. The Organization of African Unity, created in 1963, tended to be mostly a consultative meeting in practice, with the main principle being inviolable in the borders, inherited from the colonial times.
The Organization of African Unity became an instrument of the colonial project. It became an instrument of the Western powers and fell short of the wishes and aspirations of the people of the African continent. And so it became very mute, and didn't carry with it the weight of the wishes and aspirations of the working people, and so could not advance the struggle.
As long as Africa they suffer, Africa they hungry, Africa no unite, no freedom.
While politicians tried to nurse the smoldering embers of unity, the bright flame of Pan-Africanism blazed in the culture. The music of James Brown, Fela Kuti, penetrated with the motto Black Power, became an anthem of millions. The Afro hairstyle and vibrant Ankara fabrics became powerful symbols of new Pan-African identity. Meanwhile, Malcolm X preached passionately the Afro-American struggle for civil rights in the United States was linked inextricably to the liberation of Africa from colonialism, inspiring vast number of people on both sides of the Atlantic.
The college campuses had young people coming out into the streets in droves. It's the youth who galvanize a change. It's the youth, and it usually begins on college campuses.
Malcolm X's famous motto, by any means necessary, implied the rights of the oppressed people to self-defense and an uncompromising struggle for their rights, such as the Black Nationalists and the Black Panther Party, which were ready to set system of oppression ablaze.
I've been saying this in America for most of my life. You cannot reform the European settler state that is now America. Institutional white supremacy cannot be reformed. It has to be abolished.
The fiery favor of Pan-African youth sparked the revolution in Cuba, where Fidel Castro's government declared racism a relic of bourgeois past, banning racial discrimination officially. The Pan-African fire of resistance in Haiti, Jamaica, and Dominican Republic will never fade. At the turn of the century, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi attempted to nurse the smoldering embers of Pan-Africanism into a new conflagration using petrodollars as fuel. He revitalized the old idea, seeking to transform the separate fires of national interests into a single flame of African unity.
I agree that Gaddafi carries an image of a controversial figure, but he played a very key role, for example, in challenging the Western institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, which became instruments of the neocolonial project. For example, he didn't understand why the dollar was the universal currency of transaction and thought that the African continent needed our own currency. But Gaddafi was an individual. He didn't come from the mass movement. And because he didn't come from the mass movement, there was a weakness that allowed the Western powers to eventually take him down. But he played a very key role in the construction of the ideas of the unity of the African continent as an important first step towards the independence of the African continent.
Gaddafi's greatest achievement was his attempt to nurse the smoldering embers of the OAU into a bright flame of African union. Believing that the OAU was merely preserving the colonial legacy, he secured the signing of the declaration at the said summit in 1999, establishing a new organization using the European Union as an example. Gaddafi insisted on the creation of supranational bodies, a Pan-African parliament, a unified government, and a common armed forces. His utopian yet inspiring ultimate goal was the United States of Africa with a single passport, one currency, and one army.
Yeah, he was killed because he challenged the new colonial institutions. He challenged the IMF. He challenged the United Nations. He challenged the institutions that dominated the geopolitics of that time. And Western powers thought that the best thing to do was to take him out. And after taking Gaddafi out, look how it derailed the progress of the Pan-African movement.
Every fire has those who fear its lights and heat, who seek to extinguish it by any means possible. In history and today, the main enemy of Pan-African flame has the so-called collective West, the heirs of colonial empires, whose policies are based on age-old divide and rule principle.
They have divided the African people under the lines of ethnicity, under the lines of religion, under the lines of the ruling class and the working class, under the divisions of labor and so forth.
Kwame Nkrumah, who dreamt of a united and strong Africa, was overthrown by a coup orchestrated with the direct involvement of CIA. Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of independent Congo, was brutally assassinated with Belgian and American forces' participation. Nelson Mandela and his ANC movements were considered by the Western government as terrorists for many years by Britain and the US particularly, which saw them as threats to their interests during apartheid era. Muammar Gaddafi, with all the contradictions of his regime, was destroyed by NATO forces after he took decisive steps to create Pan-African financial and political institutions, challenging the hegemony of the dollar and the West. These are not random episodes, but a methodic work. The ex-colonialists having their flags and rhetoric changed to become neocolonialists. Their game remained brutal, to weaken, to fragment, to prevent Africa and the entire global South emergence as a united force. They must extinguish the flame of free Africa by any means necessary. Apartheid in South Africa wasn't just a domestic policy. It was one of the most monstrous and complete manifestations of colonialism on African soil. This system of engineered discrimination was aimed at partition of African people, ultimately alienating them from their land and methodically destroying their spirits through physical abuse, artificial borders and laws.
It comes from a project, from a construction that some people are better than others. And historically, the African people have had to fight apartheid, throughout our history. And the latest we can remember is the South Africans apartheid project, which was advanced by neocolonial agenda, backed by the United States, Israel, and then British and German forces. And what the working people of the African continent have done was to unify ourselves towards defeating apartheid in South Africa.
The struggle against apartheid became the greatest Pan-African cause, a symbol of Pan-African solidarity. It was a battle not only for the liberation of South Africa, but also for the final eradication of legacy of colonial oppression across the continent. The victory achieved in 1994 was a triumph of African people's shared will for self-determination and their inalienable rights to build a future of their own soil. Today, we see this flame of Pan-Africanism is still burning despite everything. The countries of the Sahel region are the most striking example. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, raising the banner of sovereignty, are getting one after another beyond control of their former colonial powers, expelling foreign military contingents and terminating enslaving contracts.
We are fighting to amass the resources of our continent to advance the wishes and aspirations of our people. Pan-Africanism is not just an ideology, it is a struggle.
But the struggle is not limited to the African continent. This collective West is using the same tactics in Latin America, which is the same as Africa has suffered centuries of exploitation. The blockade of Cuba is a classic example of neo-colonial policy, an attempt to strangle a recalcitrant country as a punishment for its right to chart its own path for development. The latest US hybrid attack on Venezuela, with sanctions, economic strangulations, and support of coup under the false pretext of defending democracy, is an open struggle for control of the world's largest oil reserves.
Well, the African people are united. No people want to be exploited. No people want to be humiliated. No people want their resources stolen from them and so on. So the African people are united. But of course, there are forces which would not benefit from the unity of the African people, which would not benefit from the struggles of the African people. And these forces are largely European capitalist states, the former colonial perpetrators, and so on.
The flame of Pan-Africanism is not a mere bonfire that can easily be extinguished with a splash of water. These are smoldering embers that can lie long hidden beneath the ashes of history, ready to burst into the flame again with the first wind of freedom. A wind like this today is Pan-African Progressive Front, an active network of organizations across the continent.
We will have an economic program that will help the people of Africa, because if you look at Africa currently, our economy is in tatters, it's being dominated by neoliberal thinkers. So the idea is that how do we bring progressive together?
We have been working on a new political program for the African continent. And this program we have come about after a very extensive consultation with all the stakeholders across the continent. We had to engage people within academia, people who are experts in political theory and practice, and we've come to a very solid document which we believe would be a blueprint as we march forward to a very interesting African future. At this point, we conceive a scenario where we have to make sense of history, then face the realities of the present, and then forecast into the future.
We will write a new history of Pan-Africanism, and our history is just beginning.